Iceland sits halfway across the North Atlantic Ocean, the most dangerous sea for Vikings to cross. And yet, by accident or by design, Scandinavians landed here already in 840 AD. Later, political upheaval at home led to an exodus of refugees who opposed the rule of Harald Fairhair. The Vikings who left Norway for Iceland found a completely virgin land and brought their social structures with them. The owners of the largest farms were also the high priests of the community and called Gothir. 40 Gothir held an Althing or parliament here at the Althing stone every year. Here more than anywhere else, the early Viking way of life was preserved. From here, the Viking ships ploughed the seas westward to Greenland, where 2 settlements were established. From there, they travelled as far as the American continent. For the first time, around the year 1000, the travels to the land known as Vinland was recorded by a monk who sailed with the explorer Leif Erikson.
Når det gjelder vikingferdene til Amerika,
the sagas tell us about the Viking trips to America. They are covered by the saga literature. We have to assume that there were many more voyages than described in the sagas. We have also found traces of Viking settlements in America. And there are also American Indian stories about these blue-eyed people that they met.
The settlements on the American continent lasted only a few years, while the mini-ice age of the 13th century onwards led to the decline of the Greenland settlements too. In Europe, the Violent Viking Age was reaching its climax. In Europe, the Viking invaders struck fear even more than a century after the Great Raids. The first millennium AD was a time of widespread violence. In 2012, 18 skeletons were found in the grounds of St. John's College, Oxford. Scholars immediately associated the find with the 1002 St. Brice's Day massacre, when the King of England ordered all of the Danes in his kingdom murdered. The task of identifying who these men were fell to Mark Pollard of the Forensic Archaeology Department.
We first radiocarbon dated a selection of them, and for various reasons the radiocarbon age wasn't exactly what we would have expected to be 1002 AD, but there are reasons that that might be the case. So we then began to look at the carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the bone collagen, which is an indicator of diet. And we also looked at the strontium and oxygen isotopes in the dental enamel from the teeth, because that gives you some indication of where those individuals grew up.
The skeletons from Oxford suffered a similar fate to another group found near the seaside town of Weymouth. Were they Vikings?
Yeah, we matched them with the Vikings that had been recovered from Weymouth. They're roughly contemporary from the radiocarbon dates, and other people had done strontium and oxygen in their teeth, and they found the same pattern that we found, not from the south of England. And actually on the diagram they're moving in a direction which suggests both an older geology, which is consistent with possibly Scandinavia, and also a colder climate, which is also consistent with Scandinavia.
While strontium isotope techniques suggested the victims were not from the south of England, possibly from Danelaw therefore, other marks hinted at their true identity.
Several of the skeletons showed healed wounds which may plausibly have come from blade wounds. And so I think, you know, in a group of 16 to 25-year-old males, if they're carrying healed blade wounds, then the chances are they've been in combat conflict before. So I think they're not sort of a group of people who were farmers and just sort of happened to be passing by. I think they are either professionals, mercenaries, or raiders of some description.
The beginning of the 11th century was a violent time, and national identities were less important than local and family ties.
It's quite complicated to understand what identity would have meant at that time. I think, we tend to use these titles of these are Danes and those are Anglo-Saxons, but all of this identity is a sort of a created identity, whether they are, when we say they're Danes, whether they're people who come from Denmark, or whether they might be second or third generation people born in Britain, but of originally Danish stock, and perhaps holding to Danish customs and practices, possibly dressing more like Danes than Anglo-Saxons. It's very difficult to know.
Far to the north, in York, another victim of murder was found buried under the Coppergate streets. This skeleton shows multiple blade wounds, but knowing why this young man died is almost impossible.
Why was the person killed? Obviously, we'll never know. It looks like it was violent, and you can tell that through the osteology. But if you were to try and pinpoint me down to say why can we bring that to an event, I honestly can't say. We can, but what we need to bear in mind is that what this person represents is a bloody and violent end to somebody's life, still in an era, when a lot of this is going on.
Although the legend of the Violent Viking lives on, the true nature of their society may be different from what scholars have written for centuries.
What archaeology is very good at is breaking down this idea that the Vikings are compartmentalised, the Anglo-Saxon world is compartmentalised, the Picts and the Celts are compartmentalised, and actually we start to bring that bleeding of the edges together, and we start to see a lot more complex society where people can define themselves. People obviously go to war about definition and power, but at the same time we get that input of continental imported goods. We see goods from Britain going abroad, and it just brings together, I think we make it a rich tapestry.
Perhaps the most daring of all raids left Sweden for the furthest eastern edge of the Viking world. Around 1040 AD, Ingvar the Far-Travelled and a small army of 1,000 men left central Sweden for Russia and then on to present-day Georgia, then under Arab influence, where they won a decisive battle. The land ruled by Saracens was known as Sörkland. They may have crossed the Caspian Sea and reached Tashkent, but only one of the many ships returned home. 26 runestones in Sweden commemorate the men who travelled with Ingvar, but most touching of all is this one, now standing in the grounds of Gripsholm Castle on Lake Mälaren. It tells the tale of Ingvar's brother. Tolla had this stone raised in memory of her son, Haraldr, Ingvar's brother. They travelled valiantly far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle. They died in the south, in Sörkland. Ingvar may have been of royal blood, and his family were among the leaders of the international Viking elite who still led their warriors into battle 250 years after the raid on Lindisfarne.
The most persistent myth about the Vikings is that they were thieves, they were pirates, they were great warriors, they always won all the battles, they were brave, they didn't fear death, and so on. But the truth is that they weren't better or worse than others at that time. They did live in a violent time.
The year 1000 was a turning point in the story of the Vikings. The era of the early raids was over, and Viking expansion had reached its high tide mark. But it was also the beginning of a century of even more bloodshed. The freebooting Viking chieftains faded away, and in their place, great Viking overlords, kings of whole countries who unleashed the power of Viking armies against England and against each other, spilt more blood than at any time in the preceding centuries. Rich, professional mercenary forces dominated Eastern and Western Europe. Their leaders learned the craft of kingship from their enemies and built states that are still with us today.